worried that horrific television pictures of the slaughter would eventually stain the reputation of the U.S. military.
You don't do unnecessary killing if it can be avoided. At some point, you decide you've accomplished your objectives and you stop. We owned Kuwait City. The question was, how much additional destruction do we want to inflict upon the Iraqi army that was in the Kuwait theater?
On the battlefield, Apache gunships designed to destroy tank columns were hunting down individual soldiers. To protect the American military against charges of killing for the sake of killing, Colin Powell was willing to let the surviving Iraqi forces escape. Powell decided to call Norman Schwarzkopf. It was 7 a.m. in Washington, 3 p.m. in the desert.
Colin said to me, "What are your plans?" My response to him was, "We plan to continue to execute the operation and continue to drive towards the sea, east towards the sea." And he then said to me, "How long would that take you?" And my response to him was, it will take until the end of tomorrow. So we could cease fire tomorrow evening at dark, and we would have completely accomplished the plan.
Sitting in the Pentagon, Powell knew this meant another day of killing. The president had to make a decision.
After talking to Schwarzkopf, I went over to the White House. I took the president through the situation on the ground. I pointed out they were starting to see some scenes that were unpleasant. And we were in the window of calling an end to it so as that there was not unnecessary additional loss of life on the part of American and coalition forces or on the part of Iraqi youngsters. And I would expect that within the next 24 hours, I would be bringing you a recommendation with respect to the cessation of hostilities. The president then said, well, if that's the case, we're within the window, why not end it now?
And there was a feeling, I think it was especially pronounced on the part of General Powell, that we'd asked the troops to do about all we could do by way of continuing the slaughter. I mean, in fact, the Iraqi resistance was collapsing fairly rapidly. And it was pretty clear that we'd won a tremendous victory.
Colin Powell called me. He said, "I'm at the White House. We've discussed ending the war. Could you, in fact, execute a ceasefire if it was declared effective midnight Washington time tonight?" Which would have been first thing in the morning, our time. I told him that I could live with that.
And he said, yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do, or words to that effect.
Quite frankly, the driving force behind my saying that I could live with it was the fact that if we went on another day, we were going to kill some more of our people, and we had already won an overwhelming victory with a minimum of casualties, and that was good enough for me.
While Powell and Schwarzkopf talked, the president telephoned his allies. He informed them that the time had come to end the war.
And at 5:57, 3 minutes before 6, the president reaffirmed his decision. He says, I think this is the thing to do. And that was it. That was the decision.
It was a decision that, as best I can recall, there was absolutely no dissent from on the part of any of the president's advisors.
Deep down, I wondered if we really had done quite enough, but I did not dissent from the decision. Did not argue that we should go another day.
It would be another 24 hours after the war had ended before surveillance photographs would show that half of the Republican Guard's tanks had survived.
Well, I was no longer there. I think perhaps I might have argued it very differently if I had been, and very firmly. And I think that I might have said, look, maybe this thing would never have got started unless I was a firm enough ally to do it. And I can only tell you that in my experience, we've got to do the job properly before we finish.
In the war room, there had been no thought of a ceasefire. After 6 months of planning, the next day would see the Iraqis trapped.
General Schwarzkopf
walked into the war room, and he said, "We are going to have a ceasefire." Well, I thought that he was jesting, so I said, "That's bullshit." So he says, "No, I'm serious. We will have a ceasefire." So I said, "We have not accomplished our mission. Why is it that we're going to stop what we set out to do and stop the war?" And General Schwarzkopf says, "Cal, God damn it, the President of the United States has made a decision to stop this war."
I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties, and I was willing to settle for that because that's a hell of a lot more than anybody's had in war in as long as I can remember.
At dawn, the British Army charged out of the desert towards the road running from Kuwait City to Iraq.
As we pulled over the top of the ridge, in front of us was the highway. We'd seen dead bodies before, but it was in the next few hours that once you were actually in and among it for the first time, walking around, clearing your positions or whatever, that's when it started, you know, they actually came across of how much carnage there was there.
None of these pictures appeared until after the war, but they were the scenes the men in the White House had anticipated as they weighed the political risks of continuing the conflict. The British troops called the road by the name the pilots had given it, the Highway of Death. It seems likely that 10,000 Iraqi soldiers died in the 6 weeks preceding the ground attack.
5-6. That's all you like, right?
Another 10,000 died in the 4 days of the land war.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
3 hours later, the fighting stopped. Iraqi intelligence monitored the president's announcement.
I then rang the president and told him that Bush had agreed to this ceasefire. His mood changed, just like that. He felt himself to be a great, great hero. He started to say, "We've won, we've won." His morale rose from 0 to 100.
Each day of war had left Saddam's regime more vulnerable to overthrow. Now the humiliation was over. The greatest fear, Allied tanks in Baghdad, was gone. The Allies had stopped the war. Saddam could concentrate on surviving.
They were not kind to us. They did not love us to stay in power. It was quite clear, but they wanted to avoid casualties because George Bush entered that adventure promising the American people that it will not be another Vietnam. And he kept his promise very efficiently.
On the question of going to Baghdad, if you remember the Vietnam War, we had no international legitimacy for what we did. As a result, we, first of all, lost the battle in world public opinion. Eventually, we lost the battle at home. In the Gulf War, we had great international legitimacy in the form of 8 United Nations resolutions, every one of which said, kick Iraq out of Kuwait. Did not say one word about going into Iraq, taking Baghdad, conquering the whole country, and hanging Saddam Hussein. That's point number one. Point number two, had we gone on to Baghdad, I don't believe the French would have